The morning sun filtered through the reinforced windows of Naval Station Pembroke, casting long shadows across the steel corridors of the sprawling military compound. It was 0545 hours, and the base was just beginning to stir, that particular kind of controlled chaos that defined the start of every operational day. Maintenance crews moved with purposeful efficiency through the halls. Supply officers checked manifests. Communications technicians arrived early to run their system diagnostics before the full complement of personnel flooded in. But something was off about this morning. Something that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant Commander Alexis Monroe stood in the galley of Building 4, the largest dining facility on base, moving with the quiet precision of someone who understood that discipline was just another word for survival. At 32 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, with dark blonde hair pulled back in regulation fashion, she was easy to overlook, the kind of woman men's eyes passed over without really seeing. To most of the sailors and soldiers who passed through these corridors, she was just another logistics officer, competent enough at her job, efficient with schedules and supply chains, but ultimately forgettable. Just another face in the machinery of military bureaucracy. If they only knew the truth. Alexis moved through the pre-dawn quiet of the mess deck like she owned it, which in a way she did. She'd been assigned to manage the dining facility's operations 6 months ago, a posting that most officers would have considered a dead-end career move. But Alexis had seen it differently. The mess deck was the nervous system of the base. Intelligence moved through here like blood through veins. Conversations happened. Information was exchanged. Patterns emerged. A skilled listener could learn more from an hour in the galley than from a dozen classified briefings. Her sharp gray eyes, the kind that missed nothing, though most people never bothered to look long enough to notice, scanned the serving line. She adjusted the placement of the hot beverage station, checked the temperature gauges on the warming trays, verified that the breakfast prep was on schedule. Every movement economical. Every action purposeful. There was a rhythm to her work, a meditation of sorts, that had been drilled into her since childhood. Alexis had been 6 years old when her mother first enrolled her in competitive swimming. By 12, she'd moved to advanced martial arts. By 16, she'd decided her future before most people her age could articulate their present. Her father, Captain Richard Monroe, a decorated special operations commander who'd spent 20 years pushing the boundaries of what human beings could endure, had recognized something in his daughter early on. A hunger, a relentless drive to be more than what the world expected. "Feel the discipline, Lex," he'd told her once, his weathered hands guiding her through a sequence of combat drills in their garage back in Portland, Oregon. She'd been 9 years old, her small frame drowning in his oversized training shirt. Discipline isn't about being tough. It's about being smart. It's about understanding that every breath, every movement, every decision can be the one that matters. The one that saves your life or someone else's. He deployed 6 weeks later. She'd gotten the call on her 15th birthday. An IED in Kandahar. No survivors. Captain Richard Monroe had died believing his daughter would follow in his footsteps, never knowing just how right he'd be. Alexis pulled her mind back to the present. The galley was still quiet, but that would change in approximately 7 minutes. The first wave of enlisted personnel would arrive, followed by the morning shift of officers. The place would transform from a cathedral of silence into a controlled storm of activity. She'd run this routine 1,000 times. Knew every variation, every contingency, every way things could go right or spectacularly wrong. What she didn't expect was for things to go wrong in precisely the way they were about to. The side entrance to the mess deck opened with more force than was necessary. For figures entered, sailors, judging by their uniforms, though something about them was off. They moved with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they'd been briefed on this moment. Planned for it. The lead figure was a petty officer second class named Garrett Holloway, a man Alexis had noticed around the base. Broad-shouldered, aggressive energy, the type who'd never quite matured past high school athletics. The kind of man who needed to dominate conversations, needed to be the biggest voice in any room. Behind him came 3 enlisted men she recognized from the berthing compartments. They fanned out subtly, cutting off the exit route. Not obvious, but deliberate. Alexis continued wiping down the serving counter, her movements unchanged, though her tactical mind was already calculating distances, angles of attack, and probability outcomes. Well, early as always, Holloway said, his voice carrying that particular quality of male assessment that made her skin crawl. You know, Lieutenant Commander, we've been meaning to have a conversation with you. Alexis didn't look up from her work. The cloth moved methodically across the stainless steel surface. Petty Officer Holloway, the dining facility is closed until 0600 hours. You and your crew will need to wait outside until then. That's the thing, ma'am. Holloway took a step closer, his friends moving to flank him. We're not really here about breakfast. Alexis set down the cloth, turned to face him. Her gray eyes met his with the kind of calm that suggested she'd been expecting this moment all along. Which, in a way, she had. Not today specifically, but she'd always known this day would come. The day someone on this base decided to test the quiet woman they'd underestimated. Then I suggest you state your business, Petty Officer, or remove yourselves from this facility immediately. Holloway grinned, and Alexis saw the calculation behind it. He thought he had her cornered. Thought the early morning hour, the isolation, the numerical advantage, all of it added up to a situation he could control. He was about to learn a very expensive lesson about assumptions. See, we've been hearing rumors, Holloway continued, his friends tightening their formation. Rumors about how you're not really just a logistics officer. How you weren't really assigned here for supply chain management. How maybe, just maybe, you're something else entirely. Something they don't want most people knowing about. The galley fell silent except for the hum of the refrigeration units. Alexis felt something shift inside her. The moment she'd been trained for. The moment when pretending was no longer an option. And what exactly do you think I am, Petty Officer? She asked, her voice steady and cold as December ice. Holloway's smile widened. We think you're a problem, and we think it's time someone taught you to stay in your lane. What happened next would change everything. Alexis stood motionless behind the serving counter, her posture relaxed, her expression composed into the neutral mask she'd perfected over years of military service. But internally, her threat assessment systems were running at full capacity. For hostiles, coordinated formation, aggressive body language. The situation was deteriorating, but not in a way she couldn't handle. You need to leave, Alexis said, her voice flat and professional. Now, Holloway laughed. A harsh, barking sound that echoed off the metal walls of the galley. That's cute, ma'am. Real cute. You think you can just order us around? You think your little logistics job means anything to us? One of the enlisted men behind him, a stocky sailor with a tattoo of a screaming eagle on his neck, stepped forward. Yeah, LT, we know what you really are. We've been asking questions, pulling records. You're not supposed to be here managing food supplies. Officers with your clearance level don't do that kind of work. Alexis's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. They'd figured out more than she'd given them credit for. But not enough. Not the part that mattered. Your security clearance inquiry is noted, Alexis replied, her tone remaining calm and professional. That information is classified. My assignment here is classified. And right now, you're interfering with base operations. I suggest you stand down before this becomes an official incident. Holloway's face flushed red. He'd expected her to be afraid, to show deference, to acknowledge his authority. Instead, she was treating him like an obstacle to be managed, like he was beneath her notice. Stand down. He stepped closer, his 3 companions moving with him. You're the one who needs to stand down, ma'am. We've all heard the stories about how you train in the gym at 0400 hours, how nobody's ever actually seen you fail a PT test, how you move around this base like you own it, like you're better than everyone else. The eagle-tattooed sailor added, My buddy in HR said your file is basically redacted. Entire sections are classified. That's not normal for a logistics officer. That's not normal for anyone. Alexis set down the cloth she'd been holding. Slow, deliberate, every movement controlled. I don't know what narrative you've constructed, she said, her gray eyes finally meeting Holloway's directly. But I suggest you let it go. Whatever you think you've figured out, you're wrong. And whatever you're planning to do right now, you should reconsider. Or what? Holloway took another step forward. Now he was only about 6 feet away from her, separated by the serving counter. What exactly are you going to do about it, Lieutenant Commander? File a report? Call your commanding officer? Because here's the thing, we've already done our homework. We know you don't have anyone to call. You don't have friends on this base. You don't have allies. You're just a woman playing dress-up in a man's uniform, pretending you belong in the military. The words were calculated to provoke. Alexis could see it in his eyes. He wanted a reaction, wanted her to get angry, to show emotion, to confirm that she could be rattled. He wanted the satisfaction of having gotten under her skin. She gave him nothing. Petty Officer Holloway, I'm going to tell you something only once, Alexis said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I don't care what you think about me. I don't care what stories you've heard or what records you've pulled. I don't need your approval. I don't need your respect. What I do need is for you and your crew to exit this galley in the next 30 seconds, or there will be consequences. Instead of backing down, Holloway actually smiled. He turned to his companions as if sharing a joke. You hear that? Consequences. From the logistics girl. He turned back to Alexis. Let me tell you what I think is really going on here. I think you got assigned to this base because you're washing out. I think whatever special assignment you had didn't work out, and now they've stuck you here to shuffle papers and manage the mess deck until you retire. I think you're just another washout hiding behind a rank that doesn't mean anything. One of the other sailors, a lanky petty officer with acne scars on his cheeks, added, My cousin was in naval special warfare. He said women can't hang in the teams anyway. Physically can't. So whatever story you're telling yourself, ma'am, it's a lie. Alexis felt the words like physical blows, but not for the reasons they intended. Not because they hurt her pride or because she doubted her abilities. The sting came from knowing they represented an entire culture of disbelief. An entire system built on the assumption that women didn't belong in these spaces. That if they were here, they must be less than. Must be mistakes. She'd spent her entire military career proving that assumption wrong. And yet here she stood, facing 4 men who'd decided her presence was an affront to their understanding of the world. You're right about one thing, Alexis said quietly. I don't belong where you think I belong. That's because you don't actually understand what I do or why I'm here. And frankly, petty officer, that ignorance is going to cost you if you don't walk away right now. Holloway's expression hardened. The moment of humor was over. He was done trying to provoke her. Now he wanted to intimidate. You know what the problem is with you? He said, his voice dropping to match hers. You think you're special. You think because you've read some books or done some extra training that you understand how to operate in a real military environment. But you don't. You're a woman in a man's world, and that means you're always going to be weak. Always going to be someone's support role. And any man in this military will tell you the same thing. He reached out and grabbed the edge of the serving counter, leaning forward. His 3 companions spread out slightly, creating an encircling formation. It was a subtle move, but intentional. They were trying to cut off her escape routes, trying to make her feel boxed in. What they didn't understand was that Alexis Monroe didn't feel boxed in. She felt liberated. For years, she'd hidden her training, hidden her capabilities, hidden the truth of who she really was. She'd played the role of the quiet logistics officer because the mission demanded it. Because staying under the radar was how she gathered intelligence. How she observed. How she learned the patterns of the base and the people on it. But looking at Petty Officer Holloway's confident sneer, at the casual cruelty in his eyes, at the way his companions expected her to fold, Alexis understood something crystallized and cold in her chest. This was the moment. This was the instant when she could no longer hide. I'm going to tell you something my father taught me, Alexis said, her voice steady and glacial. He told me that arrogance is the most dangerous thing a warrior can possess. Because arrogance makes you sloppy. Arrogance makes you underestimate your opponent. Arrogance makes you believe you've already won before the fight even begins. Holloway's grip on the counter tightened. Is that a threat, ma'am? Alexis smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. No, petty officer. It's an observation, and I suggest you take it seriously. For a moment, something flickered across Holloway's face. Doubt maybe, uncertainty, but it lasted only a second before his pride reasserted itself, pushing out any rational hesitation. You know what? He said, straightening up. I think it's time someone reminded you of your place. He turned to his companions and nodded. The four men began to move toward the serving counter, their intentions unmistakably clear. And that was when Alexis Monroe stepped out from behind the counter, her movements precise and economical, and showed them exactly who she really was. The galley fell silent except for the sound of controlled breathing and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. What happened next would be talked about on Naval Station Pembroke for years to come. The moment crystallized around her like a photograph being developed, each detail becoming sharper and more defined. Alexis moved sideways away from the counter with liquid grace, her body finding the open space of the galley floor. Holloway and his companions hesitated for just a fraction of a second, the instant it took for their brains to register that she'd anticipated their move, but a fraction of a second was all the advantage she needed. She didn't fight them. Not yet. Instead, she simply watched. Holloway came first, his bigger frame propelling him forward with the confidence of a man who'd never truly been tested. The other three flanked him, trying to create an overwhelming presence, to use numbers and aggression to compensate for tactical incompetence. Alexis stepped backward, her hands raised in a non-threatening posture. To anyone watching, it might have looked like she was retreating, surrendering, exactly what they expected a woman in her position to do. But Holloway's face told the real story. His eyes narrowed as he realized something wasn't right. The way she moved, the precision of it, the complete absence of fear in her expression. Something wrong, petty officer? Alexis asked, her voice carrying a quality that made even his companions pause. That hesitation was all she needed. She sidestepped his lunge, used his own momentum against him, and suddenly Holloway was on the galley floor gasping for air, his arm pinned behind his back in a control hold that would snap his shoulder if he struggled. The other three men froze. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was Holloway's labored breathing and the faint hum of the kitchen equipment. Then Alexis released him with a controlled roll that left him sprawling on his back, gasping like a fish pulled from water. You should have listened, she said quietly. She walked past them toward the exit, her body language suggesting the interaction was over. But one of the sailors, the acne-scarred one, made the mistake of reaching for her arm as she passed. His fingers closed around empty air as she pivoted, her leg sweeping low and precise. He went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. The other two backed away, their hands raised. Stand down, the taller one said, his voice shaking slightly. We're standing down. We didn't know, we thought. You thought wrong, Alexis said simply. She straightened her uniform, ran a hand over her hair to ensure it was still in regulation. Now get these two to the infirmary. Tell them they fell during morning PT. Tell them anything you want. But if I hear that this incident gets reported through official channels, if I hear that you've been talking about what happened here, there will be consequences you can't imagine. She paused at the galley entrance, her hand on the door frame. And Petty Officer Holloway? She looked back at him, still sprawled on the floor. Your cousin who said women can't hang in the teams? He was probably right. For him. But he doesn't speak for all of us. She left them there, four men in various states of shock and pain, and walked out of the galley into the pre-dawn darkness of Naval Station Pembroke. She didn't go to her quarters. Instead, she found herself walking toward the Memorial Garden, a small section of the base dedicated to those who died in service. It was a place she'd visited countless times over the years, always alone, always in the quiet hours before the base woke up. The bench was cold beneath her as she sat, her eyes fixed on the memorial wall, A sheet of polished black granite with names etched in white letters. Hundreds of them. Thousands across all the branches of service. But her eyes found only one. Captain Richard Monroe. Killed in action. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. 2008. She was 15 when she got the call. She'd been at school in chemistry class when the officers had arrived. Two men in dress blues, their faces carrying the particular expression that comes with delivering the worst news a family can receive. She'd known before they'd even opened their mouths. Somehow she'd known. The funeral had been massive. A full military honors ceremony with bagpipes and a 21-gun salute, and hundreds of servicemen and women paying their respects to a man they'd served alongside. Alexis had stood in her dress uniform, her face composed, her hands folded precisely in front of her. She hadn't cried. Not at the funeral, not at the reception afterward, not in the weeks and months that followed. Instead, she'd trained. Her mother had wanted her to process her grief through counseling, through talking, through the normal channels of support. But Alexis had chosen a different path. She'd thrown herself into physical training with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. She'd learned martial arts from a former Delta Force operator who'd known her father. She'd studied weapons, tactics, strategy. She'd read every book on military special operations ever published. And she'd made a promise to herself on the day they'd lowered her father's casket into the ground. She would finish what he'd started. Her father had been preparing her for this her entire life. The discipline, the precision, the mental toughness. Even at 6 years old, when she'd first started swimming competitively, he'd been setting the foundation. Champions aren't born, he'd told her. They're built. One decision at a time. One moment at a time. You have to decide that you're going to be better than yesterday. Better than everyone else. Better than the limitations people try to put on you. She'd decided. At 18, she'd enlisted in the Navy. At 22, she'd applied for Naval Special Warfare training. At 24, she'd become one of the first women to successfully complete SEAL team training. Not because the program had been made easier for her, but because she'd refused to be broken by it. She'd pushed through the pain, the cold, the hunger, the psychological warfare designed to break even the strongest candidates. When she'd finally made it through Hell Week, that legendary gauntlet of sleep deprivation and physical torture, she'd called her mother. "I did it, Mom," she'd said. "I'm a SEAL." Her mother had cried on the other end of the line. Alexis had held the phone steady, her voice controlled, even as something shifted inside her. A piece of her father that had been missing for 9 years suddenly felt a little bit closer. But she'd never become what her father had become. Not in the conventional sense. She'd been assigned to classified operations she couldn't discuss, to missions that existed in the gray spaces between official records and deniable operations. She'd become a specialist in intelligence gathering, in deep cover assignments, in the kind of work that required her to hide in plain sight. Which was why she'd accepted the assignment at Naval Station Pembroke. Why she'd agreed to pose as a logistics officer managing a mess deck. It wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't what most people would imagine a Navy SEAL doing. But it was necessary work. And in her experience, necessary work was the most important kind. Alexis touched the memorial wall, her fingers tracing her father's name. The granite was cold, smooth, unyielding. "I found them, Dad," she whispered into the pre-dawn darkness. "The ones responsible for what happened. The network that got you killed. I'm working on dismantling it. It's taken years, but I'm getting close." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the salt smell of the ocean that surrounded the base. For a moment, she could almost feel her father's presence beside her. Could almost hear his voice. "Keep pushing, Lex. You're close. Don't stop now." She stood, straightened her uniform one final time, and began walking back toward the base operations center. The day was beginning. The base was waking up. And somewhere in the classified files and encrypted communications networks of Naval Station Pembroke, there was a conspiracy waiting to be exposed. Alexis Monroe, daughter of Captain Richard Monroe, had made a promise to her father's grave 17 years ago. Today, she was one step closer to keeping it. She had no idea that the interaction with Holloway had just triggered a chain of events that would bring her face to face with the people responsible for her father's death, and that the reckoning, when it came, would demand everything she had. The morning sun was beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was a new day on Naval Station Pembroke, and everything was about to change. The day shifted into operational mode around midday. Alexis moved through her duties with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of compartmentalization. The incident with Holloway and his crew had been contained. She'd made certain of that. The 4 sailors had been quietly reassigned to different duties without official incident. No reports filed. No questions asked. That was how things worked in her world. Quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention. By 1600 hours, she'd finished her shift at the mess deck and had changed into civilian clothes. Jeans, a soft gray sweater, her blonde hair down around her shoulders instead of pulled back in regulation fashion. To anyone passing her on the street, she looked like any other woman off base. No more special than the dozens of military personnel who walked these same corridors every day. She'd arranged to meet him at the small coffee shop just outside the main gate, the one that catered to base personnel and was far enough from the operational areas that running into colleagues was unlikely. It had become their ritual over the past 8 months. One Thursday evening a month, they'd meet there, careful to maintain the appearance of 2 people who'd simply happened to strike up a friendship. Captain Marcus Reeves was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee already waiting. He was in civilian clothes as well, a black jacket over a navy t-shirt, his dark hair just beginning to show threads of silver at the temples. At 41, he had the bearing of a man who'd seen things most people never would. His blue eyes met hers as she approached, and there was the particular quality of recognition that came from knowing someone not just as they presented themselves to the world, but as they truly were. "Took you long enough," he said, standing to greet her. His voice was low, careful. To any observer, he would have sounded like a casual acquaintance. But Alexis heard the layers beneath. Affection, concern, the weight of whatever he'd come here to tell her. "Had to make sure I wasn't being followed," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "You know how it works." Marcus nodded, reaching for his coffee. "Yeah, I do know. That's why we need to talk." Alexis felt something shift in her chest. The tone in his voice, the way he'd positioned himself at the table, able to see both the entrance and the street beyond the window. He was in operational mode. This wasn't a casual meeting. "Tell me," she said. "There's been movement in the network," Marcus said, keeping his voice pitched low enough that the other patrons, a handful of students on laptops and an elderly couple reading newspapers, wouldn't hear. "Encrypted communications that our people have been tracking. They've been dark for months, but something triggered them to go active again." "What kind of movement?" "The kind that suggests someone at the highest levels knows you're looking for them." Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee. "There's been a security review initiated at Pembroke. Classified directive, deep background checks on all personnel with access to certain files. Your name came across the review matrix." Alexis's expression didn't change, but her mind was already running calculations. "How deep?" "Deep enough that they're going to start asking questions. Deep enough that someone in the chain of command is getting nervous about something." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "I came here to warn you personally because I can't send this information through official channels. It has to be you who decides what to do with it." She understood. Marcus was her handler, the one person in the Navy who knew exactly what she was doing at Pembroke and why. He was also the one person who could lose everything if their operation was exposed. His career, his security clearance, potentially his freedom if it was determined that they'd operated outside authorized parameters. "How much time do I have?" Alexis asked. "Maybe 2 weeks. Maybe less." Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew a small USB drive, placing it on the table between them. He used his coffee cup to screen it from view. "Everything we know so far. The communication patterns, the names that have surfaced, the connection to what happened to your father." Alexis stared at the drive without touching it. Just the sight of it made her chest tighten. This was it. This was the moment she'd been working toward for the past 2 years. The moment when everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd hidden, every lie she'd told to stay undercover could finally mean something. If I go after this now, Alexis said carefully, if I move on what's in that drive before I have all the pieces in place, the operation collapses. The network scatters. We lose them. I know. Marcus's expression was grim. But if you wait too long, they'll shut you down first. They'll pull your clearance, suspend your assignment, and whatever you've been working toward will be lost anyway. Alexis looked out the window at the street beyond. Late afternoon traffic moving in and out of the base. Military personnel in uniform mixing with civilians. A completely ordinary Thursday at a completely ordinary military installation. No one looking out these windows would imagine that inside this small coffee shop, a Navy SEAL was being warned that her cover was about to be blown. There's something else you need to know, Marcus said. His voice had dropped even lower. The security review, it's not coming from the standard channels. Someone at the highest levels is pushing it. Someone who has something to hide, and they're worried you're getting too close. Who? That's the part one couldn't figure out from my end. But whoever it is, they have enough access and authority to flag a classified investigation into personnel records without leaving a visible trail. Marcus paused. Alexis, whoever is behind what happened to your father, they're still active. They're still protected. And they just realized you're looking for them. The weight of those words settled over Alexis like a physical thing. She'd known, intellectually, that the conspiracy behind her father's death had reach, had power, had protection at high levels. But knowing it intellectually and having it confirmed by her handler were two different things. I need to see the file, she said. Not here. Marcus glanced toward the barista, then back at her. There's a maintenance storage facility on the east side of the base. Building 23. The access code is still active from the last time we used it. Tomorrow night, 2,200 hours. Come alone. I'll have everything there, all the intelligence we've gathered, all the connections we've made. Everything you need to move forward. And if I get interdicted before then you go dark, Marcus said simply. You disappear. We have protocols for that. Safe houses. New identities. Resources. But I'm hoping we won't have to go that route. I'm hoping you'll be able to move fast enough that you can finish this before they shut us down. Alexis picked up her coffee cup and took a sip, the motion giving her a moment to process. Everything was accelerating. The careful, methodical investigation she'd been conducting was about to become a race against time. There's something else, she said quietly. Holloway. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What about him? He and 3 other sailors confronted me this morning. In the galley. They'd figured out that I'm not actually a logistics officer. They were testing me, trying to see what I'd do. Did you handle it? Alexis said, quietly. No official incident. But it means someone is asking questions. Someone is suspicious. It might be connected to the security review. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Or it might be a coincidence. There's no such thing as coincidence in our line of work. No, Marcus agreed. There isn't. They sat in silence for a moment, 2 people who looked like strangers to anyone watching, but who were bound by years of partnership and a shared mission. Marcus had been her handler since she'd entered naval special warfare. He'd guided her assignments, protected her cover, and most importantly, he'd been the one person in the Navy who knew the truth about why she was really at Pembroke. I love you, Marcus said suddenly. The words were barely audible, and they used the formal phrasing that allowed the statement to be plausible if anyone was lip-reading. But they both knew what they really meant. Not romantic love, but the deep, abiding connection that came from serving alongside someone. From trusting them with your life. From knowing that they would walk into hell with you if it became necessary. I know, Alexis replied. Same. When you go after them, Marcus continued, when you finally close this loop and get the people responsible for your father's death, make sure you don't lose yourself in the process. Make sure you can come back from it. Because the Navy needs you. And I need you to survive this. Alexis reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly, a gesture that lasted just long enough to be noticed but not so long as to draw attention from nearby patrons. "Tomorrow night," she said. "Building 23. 2,200 hours. Come armed," Marcus said. "Something tells me we're about to enter the endgame." Alexis stood, gathered her things, and prepared to leave. As she walked toward the door, she didn't look back at Marcus. In their world, looking back was how you got caught. But she felt his eyes on her, watching her leave, knowing that after tomorrow night, everything would change. She stepped out into the late afternoon light and began walking back toward base, her mind already shifting into tactical mode. 2 weeks, maybe less. The clock was running, and the conspiracy that had taken her father from her 17 years ago had just realized she was coming for them. What they didn't understand was that Alexis Monroe had been training her entire life for this moment, and she had no intention of stopping now. The evening of the meeting had arrived. Alexis had spent the entire day maintaining her routine with meticulous precision. She'd worked the lunch shift at the mess deck, filed her standard logistics reports, attended a mandatory safety briefing on hazmat storage procedures. To any observer, it was an ordinary Thursday. No one could have known that she was counting down the hours until she could slip away and finally access the intelligence that would change everything. At 2,145 hours, she was alone in her quarters, a small, sparse apartment off base that she maintained as her civilian residence. She dressed in dark tactical gear, black cargo pants, a fitted black jacket, combat boots. She secured the suppressed Sig Sauer P226 that had been her service weapon for the past 8 years into a shoulder holster beneath the jacket. Then she added her backup weapon, a smaller 9mm Beretta strapped to her ankle, and checked both magazines. Fully loaded, safeties engaged, ready. She took a moment to look at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was unrecognizable as the logistics officer who spent her days managing food supplies and dining schedules. This was who she truly was. This was Alexis Monroe, Navy SEAL, daughter of Captain Richard Monroe, seeker of vengeance and justice for crimes committed in the shadows. The drive to the base took 12 minutes through late evening traffic. She entered through the secondary gate using her military ID, returned the guard's casual wave, and navigated the familiar routes toward the east side of the facility. Building 23 was a nondescript maintenance storage facility in a sector of the base that remained relatively quiet after operational hours. The structure was concrete and steel, surrounded by chain-link fencing and marked with faded yellow warning signs about hazardous material storage. Alexis checked her tactical watch. 2,158 hours. 2 minutes early. Right on schedule. She approached the building from the south side, keeping to the shadows, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd trained to move through hostile environments undetected. There were no guards on this sector. Maintenance facilities weren't considered high-value targets. But that didn't mean the area was unwatched. Alexis had learned long ago to assume that everywhere was monitored until proven otherwise. She found the side entrance that Marcus had specified. The access panel beside the door had a standard military keypad. She punched in the code, 7-3-9-4-1-1. The code changed monthly, but Marcus always updated her. The lock clicked open with a soft electronic whisper. She stepped inside. The building was dark except for the ambient light filtering through high windows. Rows of shelving units stretched into shadows, stacked with spare parts, tools, and equipment. The detritus of maintaining a military installation. The smell of machine oil and industrial cleaner hung heavy in the air. "You're punctual." A voice came from the darkness. Alexis's hand instinctively moved toward her weapon, but she stopped herself. She recognized Marcus's voice. Still, every instinct told her something was off. There was an edge to his tone, a tension that hadn't been present at their coffee shop meeting. "Show yourself," she said quietly, her hand remaining near her holstered weapon. Marcus emerged from between 2 rows of shelving, his hands visible, his expression grim. He was carrying a sealed manila envelope. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Talk." "After you left the coffee shop, I continued monitoring the communications channels. Marcus moved closer but stayed at a distance that suggested he understood her need for operational space. The security review isn't just a review. It's a pretext. Someone initiated a full counterintelligence investigation into your background. They're looking specifically at your assignments to Pembroke. They're looking at patterns. They're looking for evidence that you're conducting unauthorized operations. Alexis's jaw tightened. Who authorized it? That's the part that makes this complicated. Marcus held out the envelope. Open it. Read it. Then we talk about your next move. Alexis took the envelope and opened it. Inside were printed documents, classified memoranda, communication transcripts, security clearance reviews. As her eyes scanned the headers and signatures, her blood ran cold. The authorization for the investigation had come from Admiral Thomas Waverly, the Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire Special Operations community. A man whose career spanned 3 decades and whose influence reached into every corner of the Navy's most elite command structures. And his name appeared in 3 separate encrypted communications that had been intercepted 17 years ago. Communications that related directly to operations in Afghanistan. Communications that appeared to reference the intelligence that had led to her father's patrol being sent into an ambush. Admiral Waverly, Alexis breathed. It was him. It was him, Marcus confirmed. Or at least he was part of it. We don't know yet how deep the conspiracy goes, how many others are involved, but Waverly is central to everything. He was a junior officer back when your father was killed. He was attached to Joint Task Force operations in Kandahar. And according to the communications we've recovered, he was in direct contact with individuals outside the military chain of command. Private military contractors. Arms dealers. People operating in the gray spaces of international commerce. You're saying my father died because of military corruption? Because of money? I'm saying your father died because Admiral Waverly needed him dead, Marcus said. The exact reason, whether it was to cover up illegal weapons sales, to silence him about something he'd discovered, or to clear a path for someone's promotion, we're still trying to piece together. But the evidence is there. It's in that envelope. It's in the files. Waverly ordered your father's unit into that ambush. Alexis felt something shift inside her chest. Something cold and sharp. She'd been searching for the truth for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it would feel like when she finally found it. Not satisfaction. Not closure. Just a crystalline understanding of what had happened and who was responsible. If Waverly authorized the investigation into my background, Alexis said, her voice steady despite the rage building beneath her composure, then he knows I'm looking for him. He knows I'm conducting an unauthorized investigation. Yes. Which means you have maybe 48 hours before they move against you, Marcus interrupted. Before they shut down your access, pull your clearance, and potentially place you in custody to answer questions about your activities. Once that happens, everything you've built, everything we've discovered, it all becomes classified and hidden again. Waverly will use his authority to bury it. He's done it before. He'll do it again. Alexis was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. She'd known this moment was coming, had trained for it, but knowing something intellectually and living through it were entirely different experiences. What about you? She asked. If I move on this, if I act on the intelligence in this envelope, they'll trace it back to you. They'll know you were my handler. They'll destroy your career. I know, Marcus said. I've already accepted that. The moment I took this assignment to oversee your operations at Pembroke, I accepted the risk. This is what we do. We sacrifice pieces of ourselves so that the mission succeeds, so that justice gets served, so that the people responsible for crimes like your father's death don't just disappear into the system. There has to be another way, a way to expose Waverly without destroying. There isn't, Marcus said firmly. Not anymore. The window for a clean, official resolution closed the moment Waverly initiated the counterintelligence investigation. He's moved into the open. He's shown his hand. And now you have to move faster than he does. You have to expose him before he can silence you. Alexis looked down at the envelope in her hands. The physical evidence of 17 years of searching. The proof of what had happened to her father. The identity of the man responsible. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. "Get off this base," Marcus said. "Tonight. Don't go home. Don't pack anything. Disappear. We have protocols. Safe locations. Resources. You can contact me through the encrypted channel, but only once you're secure. And then you take Admiral Thomas Waverly down," Marcus said. "You expose him. You make sure that what happened to your father doesn't stay buried in classified files and hidden communications. You finish the mission your father never got to complete." Before Alexis could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching the building cut through the darkness. The unmistakable rumble of military transport. Multiple vehicles. Moving fast. "They're here," Marcus said, his expression hardening. "They must have tracked you coming onto the base. Go. Now." There's a maintenance tunnel access on the north side of the building. It connects to the storm drainage system. Follow it east. It exits near the perimeter fence in the maintenance sector. You'll have maybe 5 minutes before they seal off this section of the base. "Come with me," Alexis said. "Can't." Marcus shook his head. "I'll buy you time. I'll tell them I was here doing an inventory check. I'll delay them, but you need to move. Now." Alexis wanted to argue, wanted to find another solution, but she'd trained too long, understood the operational realities too well. There was no time for debate. There was only action. She moved toward the north side of the building, envelope clutched in her hand. Behind her, she heard Marcus positioning himself near the entrance, preparing to confront whoever was about to walk through that door. She found the maintenance tunnel access exactly where he'd said it would be. A grated opening in the floor, leading down into darkness. She descended quickly, her eyes adjusting to the blackness, the sound of tactical vehicles parking outside growing fainter. As she moved through the tunnel system, moving east toward the perimeter fence, Alexis understood that everything had changed in a single moment. She was no longer operating undercover, no longer conducting a hidden investigation. She was running, hunted. And Admiral Thomas Waverly had just made the final mistake of his career by forcing her into the open. Because now there was nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing to lose was the most dangerous thing a conspiracy could create. The tunnel system beneath Naval Station Pembroke was a labyrinth of concrete and corroded metal. Alexis moved through it with her Sig Sauer drawn, her tactical flashlight creating a thin beam that cut through the absolute darkness. The air was thick and stale, carrying the smell of stagnant water and rust. Her footsteps echoed off the walls, each sound a small betrayal of her position. She'd been running for 40 minutes. The drainage tunnel had taken her to a maintenance junction, which had connected to a secondary electrical corridor, which had branched into a network of passages she'd partially memorized from studying the base schematics weeks ago. But partial knowledge was becoming dangerous. The base was larger than she'd accounted for, more complex. And behind her, she could hear the faint sounds of pursuit. Dogs barking, voices shouting orders. The organized sweep of a military installation going into lockdown mode. She emerged from the tunnel system near the eastern perimeter fence, exactly as Marcus had said she would. The fence was illuminated by harsh sodium vapor lights, and beyond it lay the civilian streets that bordered the base. If she could make it through the fence, she could disappear into the city. Get to a safe house. Access her emergency protocols. Alexis was 30 feet from the fence when the spotlight caught her. The beam of light was bright enough to burn her vision, forcing her to squint against it. She heard the mechanical whine of a vehicle's horn, followed by shouted commands. "Stop! Military police! Drop your weapon!" She didn't stop. She ran. The crack of a gunshot split the night air. Then another. The rounds were high, deliberately aimed to miss but close enough to communicate the seriousness of the threat. Military police weren't trained to kill without cause, but they were trained to stop fugitives from escaping base. The rules of engagement were clear. She was now classified as a security threat. They would use force to interdict her. Alexis veered left, away from the fence, using the shadows of the storage buildings to break line of sight with the spotlight. The fence grew closer with every stride, but so did the voices of her pursuers. She could hear boots hitting pavement, could hear the static chatter of radios coordinating her containment. 20 feet from the fence. 15. 10. She launched herself at the chain link barrier, her hands finding purchase on the metal diamond pattern. She was halfway up when the spotlight found her again. More gunshots. These weren't warning shots. These were rounds designed to disable. Aimed at her legs, her shoulders, anywhere that wouldn't be instantly lethal but would stop her from climbing. One round passed so close to her head that she felt the concussive pressure of its passage. Another struck the fence near her hand, sending sparks of torn metal spinning into the darkness. Alexis pulled herself up and over the top of the fence with raw desperation. She dropped to the other side, hitting pavement hard, and immediately rolled to her feet. Pain lanced through her left shoulder. A graze wound from one of the rounds, but she ignored it. Pain was information. Information could be processed later. Right now, she needed to move. She was running through civilian streets now, away from the base, her black tactical gear making her visible to anyone watching. She could hear sirens in the distance. Base security would be coordinating with local law enforcement. The net was closing. She'd made it 6 blocks when the black SUV cut off her escape route. Alexis tried to change direction, but a second vehicle appeared, blocking that route as well. The doors opened and federal agents emerged. She could see the FBI windbreakers clearly in the streetlight glow. Behind them came Navy Criminal Investigative Service personnel. Behind them came uniformed military police. She was surrounded. Alexis made the tactical calculation in less than a second. 4 agents in front of her. 2 vehicles blocking escape routes. At least a dozen military personnel visible, with more arriving every second. Her Sig Sauer had 16 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. The odds were not in her favor. She raised her hands, the pistol held carefully so that the agents could see it was secured and posed no immediate threat. Then she slowly lowered herself to one knee, keeping her movements controlled and predictable. "I'm putting the weapon down," she called out. "Don't shoot." She placed the Sig Sauer on the pavement in front of her, then the Beretta from her ankle. She raised her hands above her head, her fingers splayed to show she was unarmed. "Lie down," one of the agents commanded. "Hands behind your head. Now." Alexis complied. The pavement was cold against her face as she stretched out, her body completely exposed and vulnerable. Within seconds, hands were on her, professional and efficient. Zip ties cinched around her wrists. A hood was pulled over her head, plunging her into darkness. She felt herself being lifted, carried toward a vehicle, placed roughly into the back seat. The ride took approximately 20 minutes. She tracked it through the movement of the vehicle, the turns, the sounds of traffic. They were taking her off base, toward some federal facility. NCIS had jurisdiction over crimes involving military personnel, and she was now officially classified as something between a fugitive and a national security threat. The vehicle stopped. Doors opened. Alexis was pulled from the back seat and marched forward through what sounded like an underground garage. The temperature was cool, controlled. Fluorescent lights flickered on somewhere. She could hear the distant hum of institutional machinery. They'd taken her to a federal building, some kind of holding facility. She was guided into a room and forced into a chair. The hood was removed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Alexis blinked in the harsh fluorescent light, her eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. She was in an interrogation room, concrete walls, metal table, 2 chairs bolted to the floor. On the opposite side of the table sat a man in a dark suit. FBI, judging by the bearing and the credentials hanging from a chain around his neck. His name tag read, Special Agent David Thornton. "Lieutenant Commander Monroe," Thornton said, his voice carrying the particular tone of authority that came from knowing you had all the power. "I'm Special Agent David Thornton, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're being held on suspicion of violating the Espionage Act, theft of classified materials, and conspiracy to commit unauthorized military operations. Do you understand your rights? Alexis said nothing. She understood her rights perfectly. She also understood that anything she said could and would be used to strengthen whatever case they were building against her. We found the classified materials you were attempting to remove from the base, Thornton continued. He opened a folder and slid it across the table. The manila envelope Marcus had given her. We found your weapons. We have video of you evading base security and federal agents. We have testimony from military personnel that you've been conducting unauthorized investigations into classified operations. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Here's what you need to understand, Thornton said. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever mission you think justifies breaking federal law, it's over. You're finished. Your career is over. Your security clearance is revoked. Your access to classified information is terminated. You are now facing federal charges that could result in 25 years in prison. I want a lawyer, Alexis said. It was her first words since being arrested. Her voice was steady, controlled, despite the fact that she understood exactly how dire her situation had become. You'll get one, Thornton said. But before that happens, I want you to understand something. Admiral Thomas Waverly is the Deputy Commander of Naval Special Warfare. He's one of the most respected and decorated officers in the United States military. And you've accused him, in these materials, of conspiracy to murder a fellow service member, of illegal arms trafficking, of corruption at the highest levels of military command. Thornton closed the folder. Do you understand how serious that accusation is? Do you understand that making false accusations against a flag officer is itself a federal crime? Alexis stared at him, understanding perfectly what he was saying. Waverly had reached down and protected himself. He'd used his authority to have her arrested before she could make her accusations public. He'd used the system itself to silence her. I want a lawyer, she repeated. You'll get one, Thornton said, standing up. But I want you to think about something while you sit here. Think about the fact that Admiral Waverly is the only person with the authority and the motive to have initiated the investigation that led to your arrest. Think about the fact that your handler, Captain Marcus Reeves, is currently in custody as well. Think about the fact that we've seized all the evidence you were attempting to collect. Think about the fact that Admiral Waverly is still free, still in command, still untouchable. He moved toward the door. And think about the fact that you failed. Whatever you were trying to accomplish, whatever justice you were trying to serve, you failed. The door closed behind him, leaving Alexis alone in the interrogation room. She was in custody. Marcus was in custody. The evidence was in federal hands. And Admiral Thomas Waverly, the man responsible for her father's death, remained free and in power. But as Alexis sat there, handcuffed to the table, her shoulder throbbing from the graze wound, her mind already calculating her options, she understood something that Thornton had missed, something that her father had taught her before he died. The most dangerous prisoner is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. And Alexis Monroe was about to prove something that would shake the foundations of the United States military. The holding cell was 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls painted institutional gray. A single metal bunk with a thin mattress. A toilet and sink combination bolted to the wall. A small window reinforced with wire mesh that looked out onto a brick wall. Federal Detention Facility, Maximum Security Wing. They'd brought her here after the interrogation with Agent Thornton, after they'd photographed her, processed her, and placed her in the system as an enemy of the state. Alexis sat on the bunk and waited. She'd been incarcerated for 16 hours. During that time, she'd been denied access to counsel, denied phone calls, denied even basic communication with the outside world. The legal system had rendered her invisible. She existed in the gaps between official procedures, in the gray spaces where national security could override constitutional rights. It was exactly where Waverly wanted her, contained, isolated, powerless. But Alexis had prepared for this contingency long before she'd ever accepted the assignment at Naval Station Pembroke. The guard came by at 0600 hours with breakfast, a plastic tray with lukewarm oatmeal, a small carton of milk, a piece of wheat toast. He didn't speak to her. They'd been instructed not to engage with her in any way. She was dangerous. She was a traitor. She was to be treated as a security threat at all times. She waited until the guard had moved past her cell out of sight. Then she moved. Alexis had kept one piece of equipment when they'd arrested her. Something so small, so innocuous, that the federal agents who'd conducted the strip search had completely missed it. A titanium dental bridge, a piece of her back molar that had been specially fabricated by a naval medical technician who specialized in classified equipment. The bridge was actually a composite construction containing 3 distinct tools: a microsaw blade, a universal pick set, and a small USB drive containing backup copies of the intelligence she'd been gathering. She'd extracted the dental bridge from her mouth the night of her arrest, using a technique that had taken her months to perfect. It had required dislocating her jaw, repositioning the bridge, and then carefully resetting the joint. Painful but possible. The federal agents had searched her cell immediately after her intake, but by then the bridge was hidden in the hollow space between the concrete wall and the metal bunk frame. A cavity she'd created by loosening a bolt in the frame and widening the gap using nothing but her fingertips and patience. Now, with the guard gone, she retrieved it. The dental bridge went back into her mouth carefully. The discomfort was immediate and sharp, but manageable. She'd lived with worse. She'd trained with worse. Pain was just another form of information, and right now, she had a use for this particular piece of equipment. The microsaw blade was razor-sharp and exactly the size of a dental instrument. Over the next 6 hours, working in small increments during times when the guard rotation placed the least scrutiny on her cell, she used the blade to slowly cut through the restraint bolts on her bunk. The work was meticulous, precise, requiring absolute control to avoid creating sounds that would alert the guards. By 1400 hours, the bolts were severed. The bunk frame could now be manipulated. More importantly, the process had revealed something else. The wall cavity behind where the bolts had been contained not just empty space, but a deteriorated electrical conduit. An old wire passage that had been abandoned during a renovation. Alexis had studied the building blueprints before her arrest, studying every inch of the federal detention facility. The electrical conduits ran through the walls, connecting different sections of the facility. One particular conduit, the one directly behind her cell, ran down toward the basement level where the old utility systems were housed. She pulled the bunk frame away from the wall, creating just enough space to squeeze behind it. The cavity was tight, suffocating, but accessible. She began removing the deteriorated conduit casing, careful not to create noise that would carry through the facility's acoustic properties. Each piece of conduit she removed opened the passage a little wider. By 1800 hours, she had a hole large enough to fit through. She squeezed into the narrow space behind the wall, pushing herself into darkness and dust and the accumulated detritus of decades. The electrical conduit was just barely wide enough for her to fit, forcing her to move sideways, compressing her shoulders and hips to squeeze through. It was disorienting, claustrophobic, designed to break the spirits of anyone trapped in its confines. But Alexis had been trained to operate in worse circumstances. Her father had put her through sensory deprivation exercises as a child. Naval Special Operations training had taught her to function when everything in her psychological makeup was screaming at her to panic. She moved through the darkness with methodical precision, following the conduit as it descended toward the basement level. The pipe grew warmer as she progressed, suggesting she was getting closer to active electrical systems. That warmth was disorienting in the absolute blackness, but it also meant she was on the right path. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 30 minutes, she felt the conduit opening out into a larger space. She pushed herself through the final section and dropped into the basement utility room. The fall was only about 5 feet, but it knocked the wind from her lungs. She lay on the concrete floor of the basement for a moment, allowing her body to recover, her senses to adjust to the ambient light filtering through high basement windows. The utility room was filled with old equipment, circuit breakers, water pipes, heating systems, the mechanical infrastructure that kept the facility operating. Alexis pulled herself to her feet, her body aching from the exertion of moving through the conduit. She could hear sounds from above, the normal operations of the facility continuing as if she was still locked in her cell. The guard wouldn't discover her absence for at least another 5 hours when they came to deliver dinner. She had a window of opportunity. Not a large one, but enough. Alexis moved through the basement, locating the server room where the facility maintained its digital infrastructure. The lock was standard electronic but not military grade. She used the pick set from her dental bridge to bypass it in under 3 minutes. The computer systems inside were networked, connected to the federal database infrastructure. She connected the USB drive from her bridge to the nearest terminal, uploading the backup copies of her intelligence files to a secure server she'd established before her assignment to Pembroke. The upload took 14 minutes. When it was complete, she had insurance. Not just the physical evidence, but digital copies of everything. Encrypted, secured, set to auto-release to a list of journalists, senators, and federal prosecutors if she didn't disarm the protocol within 72 hours. Waverly had thought capturing her would end this. He'd thought imprisoning her would silence her. But he'd underestimated something fundamental. Alexis Monroe didn't just survive in the gray spaces. She thrived there. She left the server room and continued moving through the basement, locating the facility's laundry service. She changed out of her federal detention jumpsuit and into guard-issue fatigues she found in a storage area. The fit wasn't perfect, but it was close enough that a casual observer wouldn't question her. She found a service exit that led toward the facility's loading dock. The evening shift change was happening, and in the chaos of personnel rotation, she simply walked out with a group of departing workers. No alarm sounded. No one stopped her. She was free. As she disappeared into the civilian streets surrounding the federal facility, her mind was already calculating her next moves. Marcus was still in custody, but she could work on freeing him. The evidence she'd uploaded was secure, but she needed to manage its release strategically. And Admiral Thomas Waverly was still walking free, still believing he'd won. But the game had just changed. Alexis Monroe had gone from being a prisoner to being a ghost, a phantom operating in the spaces between official detection. And her father had taught her long ago that ghosts were far more dangerous than any physical threat. She had 3 days to bring Admiral Waverly down. 3 days before the insurance protocol auto-released and the world learned the truth about his crimes. 3 days. She was going to need every second of it. The safe house was located in Alexandria, Virginia, a modest 2-story townhouse in a neighborhood populated by government contractors and intelligence community professionals. It was exactly the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask questions about their neighbors. Alexis had accessed it using protocols established years before her assignment to Pembroke. Deep cover contingency measures that had been funded through classified channels and hidden in appropriations that no one would ever connect to her. Inside, she had everything she needed. Clean clothes, cash, multiple sets of identification documents under different names, weapons secured in a hidden wall safe, a laptop computer with military-grade encryption, and most importantly, she had communications equipment that couldn't be traced. She'd been in the safe house for 6 hours when the first message came through the encrypted channel. It was from a journalist named Patricia Holloway at the Washington Post. No relation to Petty Officer Garrett Holloway, though Alexis noted the irony. Patricia had been monitoring the intelligence community for 15 years. She had sources everywhere. And most importantly, she had a reputation for protecting her sources and publishing stories that brought down powerful people. The message was brief. I received your encrypted data package. This is massive. Need confirmation you're still secure. Can move forward with story in 48 hours if you give green light. Alexis sent back, confirm secure. Story is greenlit, but I need 72 hours. Have additional intelligence to gather before publication. After publication, auto-release protocols will flood the networks with classified communications. You need to be ready to report on the full scope, not just the initial expose. Patricia's response came back within minutes. Understood. 72 hours. But you understand they're hunting for you? FBI has you flagged as a fugitive. Military police have standing orders. The entire intelligence community knows your face and description. How long can you stay hidden? Alexis stared at that message for a long time. How long could she stay hidden? The answer was, as long as it took. She'd become a ghost before. She could do it again. But first, she needed to free Marcus. Marcus Reeves was being held at the same federal detention facility where she'd been imprisoned. The charges against him were serious: conspiracy to conduct unauthorized military operations, aiding and abetting a fugitive, violations of the Espionage Act. Waverly had made sure the charges would be impossible to dismiss quickly. But Alexis had options that the normal legal system didn't provide. She spent the next 18 hours planning the operation. Marcus was being held in the administrative detention wing, separate from her former location. He'd be in a higher security area with more guards, more surveillance. A direct assault would be suicide. She needed to be smarter. The plan came together in pieces. First, she needed to create a distraction. Something big enough to pull resources away from the detention facility, but not so catastrophic that it would alert Waverly that she was still operating. She made phone calls. Anonymous tips to federal agencies about terrorist plots that didn't exist, claims of suspicious activities at shipping facilities, reports of weapons caches in storage units across the D.C. metro area. Within hours, the FBI's Washington field office was coordinating with local law enforcement to investigate dozens of false leads. Second, she needed to establish a legal pathway to Marcus's release. She contacted a federal defense attorney named Samuel Chun through encrypted channels. Chun had represented classified operations personnel before. He understood the gray spaces. She sent him evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, the way Agent Thornton had violated Miranda rights during her interrogation, the way the government had seized evidence without proper warrant procedures, the way her interrogation had been conducted without legal counsel present despite explicit requests. This is enough to get an emergency motion for dismissal filed. Chun responded after reviewing the documentation. But the government will fight it. They'll argue national security. This could take weeks to litigate. You have 48 hours, Alexis replied. File every motion you have. Demand immediate bail hearings. Claim violations of constitutional rights. Force them to justify the detention in open court. Make them put Waverly's involvement on record. The next piece was more dangerous. She needed to move against the facility's security infrastructure directly. Alexis obtained the service uniforms and credentials of a federal security contractor. She created false digital work orders authorizing her access to the detention facility's technical systems under the guise of conducting routine maintenance on the surveillance network. The work orders were sophisticated forgeries, created using copies of legitimate government templates she'd saved during her time at Pembroke. She entered the federal detention facility at 0630 hours on her second full day free, carrying a laptop bag and the bearing of someone who had every right to be there. The security guard at the entrance barely glanced at her credentials before waving her through. She went directly to the surveillance control room on the third floor. The technical staff was minimal, 2 civilian contractors monitoring camera feeds. She had fake work authorization that looked legitimate. When she told them she was there to update the surveillance software to patch a critical security vulnerability, they didn't question her. She spent 90 minutes in the system, her fingers flying across the keyboard, making subtle alterations to the surveillance record. Not deleting footage that would trigger immediate alarms, but editing it, creating seamless loops that would show Marcus remaining in his cell even when he wasn't. Editing security door logs to show he'd never left his wing. When she was done, she'd created a window, a gap in the surveillance record that would be virtually impossible to detect unless someone specifically looked for it. The final piece was the most delicate. She needed to get Marcus out of his cell. She waited until the shift change at 1,400 hours. The detention facility underwent a transition period where guards rotated, supervision was momentarily diffuse, and the systematic attention that maintained security was briefly interrupted. She approached the detention wing wearing a federal prosecutor's badge she'd fabricated, complete with holographic security features that would stand up to casual inspection. "I need to speak with Captain Marcus Reeves," she told the guard at the wing entrance. Federal prosecution needs additional testimony regarding the national security implications of his actions. This is time-sensitive. The guard made a call, verifying authorization through channels that had been compromised by Alexis's manipulation of the facility's communication systems. Within minutes, She was escorted to the interrogation room where Marcus was being held. They had exactly 12 minutes, the length of time the false work order allowed before her presence would be logged as unusual by the security system. "We need to move," Alexis said the moment the door closed. "Now." Marcus's eyes widened. "Alexis? How?" "No time. Listen. The southeast stairwell has been removed from the active surveillance loop for the next 10 minutes. After that, it comes back online. We need to be off this floor and out of the facility by then. Can you run?" Marcus didn't ask how she'd done what she'd done. That was the mark of a true operator, trusting the plan, trusting the capability of the person executing it. He simply stood up. They moved through the detention facility like shadows, down the stairwell that surveillance couldn't track, through a service corridor that led toward the basement. Alexis had the route memorized, had practiced it 100 times in her mind. The federal facility's layout, its security systems, its vulnerability points, she'd studied them all. They emerged into the basement laundry room. Alexis had clothes waiting, federal facility uniforms that would allow them to blend in with the staff. Within minutes, they were walking out the service exit with a group of departing workers, just as Alexis had done during her own escape. The vehicle was waiting 2 blocks away, a gray sedan parked on a side street with its engine running. Alexis had rented it using a false identity, paid cash, left no traceable documentation. She and Marcus got in, and she drove away at legal speeds, careful not to trigger any attention from law enforcement. It wasn't until they were across the Potomac River and heading toward Maryland that Marcus spoke. "You broke us out of federal detention," he said. "Alone, without support, without authorization." "We're past authorization," Alexis replied, her eyes on the road, her hands steady on the wheel. "We're past the point where official channels can help us. Right now, we're only accountable to ourselves and to the mission." "The mission," Marcus echoed. "Which is?" "Bringing down Admiral Thomas Waverly," Alexis said. "Exposing the conspiracy. Making sure that what happened to my father, what they tried to do to us, doesn't happen to anyone else." She glanced at him briefly. "And we have exactly 48 hours to do it before the insurance protocols auto-release and force us into direct confrontation with every federal agency in the government." Marcus nodded. He understood the stakes. He understood what came next. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Everything," Alexis said. "I need you to help me burn it all down." The operations center was a rented space in a converted warehouse in Bethesda, Maryland. Marcus had connections, old contacts from his days running classified operations who understood the necessity of operating outside official channels. The space had everything they needed: secure communications equipment, multiple computer terminals, surveillance displays, and most importantly, isolation from federal monitoring systems. It was 1,800 hours on their second full day free. Alexis and Marcus stood before a wall covered with photographs, documents, and connecting lines that mapped out the conspiracy. 17 years of military corruption, illegal weapons sales, the murder of Captain Richard Monroe, everything that had driven Alexis toward this moment. But now they faced a decision that had no good solution. "The intelligence package is solid," Marcus said, pointing at the classified communications they'd recovered. "We have Admiral Waverly's direct involvement in the decision to send your father's unit into Kandahar. We have evidence of communications with private military contractors. We have financial records showing massive transfers to overseas accounts. The case against him is airtight." "But," Alexis said, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but taking him down through official channels would require exposing sources and methods we've spent decades protecting," Marcus continued. "The intelligence that proves his guilt came from classified surveillance programs, from wiretaps that weren't technically authorized, from signals intelligence that exists in legal gray areas. If we expose all of that to bring down one admiral, we compromise the entire apparatus that protects national security." Alexis understood. It was the eternal calculus of operating in classified spaces. How much damage were you willing to do to the system to hold one person accountable? How much collateral damage was acceptable in pursuit of justice? "There's another problem," Patricia Holloway's voice came through the encrypted video feed. She was calling from the Washington Post's secure communications room. If I publish the story with the full intelligence package, the government will immediately issue an injunction. They'll claim national security. The courts will side with them. They always do when it comes to classified information. The story dies before it ever reaches the public. So we can't publish the evidence directly, Alexis said, working through the problem. The government will suppress it. Not if we release it all at once, Patricia said. If we dump everything, all the intelligence, all the communications, all the evidence, simultaneously to every major news organization, every congressional committee, and every federal prosecutor at once, they can't stop it all. Some of it will get out. Some of the truth will reach the public. But that requires releasing classified information, Marcus said. Deliberately breaking federal law. We're talking espionage charges. Years in prison. Yes, Patricia confirmed. You're talking about sacrificing your freedom and your careers to expose one conspiracy. The question is whether you're willing to pay that price. Alexis moved to the window overlooking the warehouse district. Night was falling, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray. She thought about her father, thought about the 17 years she'd spent training, preparing, waiting for this moment, thought about the cost that had already been paid. There's a third option, Marcus said quietly. We could go to the media with what we have, but selectively. We could release enough evidence to create public pressure without releasing the raw classified materials. We could let journalists do the investigation, corroborate the claims, verify the intelligence using open sources. It would take longer, but it might preserve some of the classified programs. And give Waverly time to cover his tracks, Alexis said. To destroy evidence. To ensure his subordinates stay silent. To use his authority to make the investigation disappear. She turned back to face Marcus. He's already proven he'll use federal agencies against us. He's already shown he'll corrupt the system to protect himself. If we give him breathing room, he uses it. So we commit to the full release, Marcus said. We sacrifice everything to bring him down. Unless, Patricia interjected, there's a way to force his hand, to make him expose himself without needing to release all the classified materials. How? Alexis asked. Confrontation, Patricia said. You go directly to him. You present him with evidence. You give him the choice. Resign, confess, and accept the consequences quietly, or we release everything and destroy you publicly. That's blackmail, Marcus said. Yes, Patricia acknowledged. It's also potentially the only way to prevent a full intelligence disaster while still achieving justice. Alexis understood the implications. A direct confrontation with Waverly would be dangerous. It would put her in a position where he controlled the environment, where he had resources and authority. But it would also give her leverage, the knowledge that she had insurance, that her death wouldn't stop the release, that her disappearance wouldn't silence the truth. There's another consideration, Marcus said carefully. If you confront Waverly, he'll have you arrested immediately. He'll have federal agents surrounding you before the conversation is even finished. Your leverage means nothing if you're in custody. Unless I'm not alone, Alexis said. Unless we make the confrontation public. Unless there are witnesses present who can document what happens. She looked at Patricia through the video feed. Can you arrange a meeting? Somewhere public? Somewhere that Waverly can't simply have me arrested without drawing attention. I can arrange it, Patricia said. I can offer him an interview, exclusive story with the Washington Post about his career, his accomplishments, his perspective on military leadership. He'd jump at the opportunity. Admirals like to control their narratives. And then, Marcus asked, and then I show him the evidence, Alexis said. I give him a choice. I document his reaction. I let him know that if anything happens to me, the insurance protocols activate and everything becomes public. It's suicide, Marcus said flatly. He'll have you arrested. He'll claim you were attempting to extort him. He'll use the legal system against you. Probably, Alexis agreed. But at that point, the truth is already in motion. Patricia goes public with the story of how I confronted him. The insurance protocols are set to activate in 24 hours if I don't deactivate them. He can arrest me, but he can't stop what comes next. She paused, understanding the weight of what she was proposing. My father sacrificed his life believing in something bigger than himself. He died trying to protect his brothers in arms. I'm not going to hide in the shadows while the man responsible for his death remains free and protected by the system my father died defending. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. When? He asked. Tomorrow, Alexis said. We set up the meeting for tomorrow morning. 0900 hours. Neutral location. Patricia documents everything. And I give Admiral Thomas Waverly one opportunity to do the right thing. He won't, Marcus said. I know, Alexis replied. But I have to offer him the chance anyway. My father would expect nothing less. Patricia's face on the screen showed the particular expression of a journalist who understood she was about to witness something historically significant. I'll arrange it, she said. I'll have the interview scheduled for 0900 tomorrow at the Hotel Marquis in downtown D.C. Public restaurant, multiple witnesses, security cameras everywhere. It's the closest thing to a safe environment you're going to get. After the confrontation, Alexis said, you go straight to publication. You don't wait for confirmation from me. You don't verify with Waverly's office. You publish everything the moment you have it. Understood, Patricia confirmed. Alexis looked back at Marcus. You need to activate the insurance protocols. All of them. Complete data dump to every possible channel. News organizations, congressional committees, federal prosecutors, international media outlets. Make it so widespread that no single government agency can contain it. That's treason, Marcus said quietly. Deliberately releasing classified military intelligence. I know, Alexis said. Welcome to the endgame, Marcus. This is where ideology meets reality. This is where we find out if we actually believe in the principles we've been defending. Marcus stood up. He walked to the communications terminal and began typing commands. Within minutes, he'd initiated protocols that would release decades of classified intelligence across multiple channels. Automated systems that couldn't be stopped once activated. A digital avalanche that would bury Admiral Thomas Waverly under the weight of his own crimes. It's done, Marcus said, stepping back from the terminal. In 24 hours, if you don't deactivate this, every secret Admiral Waverly has spent his career protecting becomes public knowledge. Alexis felt something shift inside her. A sense of finality. An understanding that she'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was no longer fighting to maintain the system. She was fighting to expose how fundamentally the system had been corrupted. Get some rest, she told Marcus. Tomorrow, everything changes. She spent the night reviewing the intelligence one final time, preparing for the confrontation, understanding every detail of Admiral Waverly's crimes so thoroughly that there would be no room for denial or manipulation. And when dawn broke over Bethesda, Alexis Monroe prepared for the moment that would define not just her life, but the future of military accountability itself. In 24 hours, Admiral Thomas Waverly would have to answer for what he'd done. And Alexis Monroe was finally ready to make him pay. The Hotel Marquis was a 5-star establishment in downtown Washington, D.C., the kind of place where power brokers conducted business over expensive coffee and where discretion was literally built into the architecture. The Meridian restaurant occupied the main floor, all floor-to-ceiling windows and elegant minimalism. It was 0855 hours. In 5 minutes, Admiral Thomas Waverly would arrive for what he believed was an exclusive interview with Patricia Holloway, the Washington Post's senior military correspondent. Alexis sat at a corner table, dressed in professional civilian clothing. A dark blazer, slacks, her blonde hair styled in a way that made her look like a business consultant or government official. To the casual observer, she was simply another person working through her breakfast while checking her phone. No one would have recognized her as the fugitive Navy SEAL whose face was currently on federal watch lists across the country. Patricia sat at an adjacent table, her recorder disguised as part of a routine notebook. She had a small camera embedded in the clasp of her briefcase, positioned to capture everything that was about to happen. The setup was professional, discreet, exactly what they needed. Alexis felt her heart rate steady as she monitored the restaurant's entrance. She'd trained for this her entire life. Every combat scenario, every interrogation technique, every lesson about maintaining composure under pressure, it all converged on this single moment. She had no weapons. She had no backup team hidden in the restaurant. What she had was the truth, the evidence, and the understanding that Admiral Waverly had made a fatal strategic error by choosing to underestimate her. At 0901 hours, Waverly arrived. He was exactly as she remembered, immaculate uniform, silver stars on his shoulders, the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. He was flanked by 2 aides, both in dress uniforms, both carrying the particular nervous energy of junior officers in the presence of a flag officer. They remained at the restaurant entrance as Waverly crossed toward Patricia's table, his hand extended in greeting. Patricia stood, shook his hand with professional warmth, and gestured for him to sit. The restaurant staff seemed to collectively understand that this particular table required discretion. They maintained distance, ensured privacy, acted as if the conversation wasn't happening. That's when Alexis stood up. She moved across the restaurant with deliberate purpose. Her movements weren't threatening, but they were unmistakably intentional. She reached Patricia's table and pulled out an empty chair, sitting down directly across from Admiral Waverly before either he or Patricia could respond. Waverly's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Recognition, shock, confusion, then a cold, calculating settling into tactical awareness. He understood immediately who she was and what this moment represented. "Admiral Waverly," Alexis said, her voice low enough that only their table could hear, but loud enough that Patricia's hidden microphone would capture every word. "Thank you for meeting with us. Captain Reeves." Waverly began, his voice controlled, his expression already shifting into damage control mode. "Lieutenant Commander Monroe," Alexis corrected. "And this isn't really an interview, is it, sir? This is the moment where you understand that your cover has been completely compromised." Waverly's jaw tightened. His hand moved slightly, a gesture that suggested he was considering signaling his aides. But he stopped himself. He was too intelligent to cause a scene, too politically astute to give Alexis exactly what she needed, visible aggression in a public space. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Waverly said carefully, "but I strongly suggest you stand up and leave this restaurant. Immediately. You're a fugitive. You're subject to arrest. You have no authority here." "I have authority that supersedes yours," Alexis replied. She placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "That contains evidence of your involvement in the conspiracy that resulted in the death of Captain Richard Monroe in Kandahar, Afghanistan, in 2008. It contains communications between you and private military contractors discussing illegal weapons sales. It contains financial records documenting millions of dollars in payments to offshore accounts. It contains the complete intelligence picture of a corruption operation that has been running for nearly 2 decades. Waverly didn't reach for the envelope. His eyes didn't even flicker toward it. But Alexis could see the calculation happening behind his expression. The speed with which a trained officer at his level could assess multiple scenarios simultaneously. "That's classified information," Waverly said, "obtained through unauthorized means, inadmissible in any court, and threatening to release it would constitute espionage on your part." "Correct on all counts," Alexis agreed, "which is why I'm not threatening to release it. I'm giving you a choice." She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower, the intensity in her gray eyes absolute. "You have one opportunity to do the right thing. You resign from your position. You issue a statement taking responsibility for your actions. You cooperate with federal prosecutors investigating military corruption. And you accept the consequences of your crimes. If you do that, the evidence stays contained. The classified materials remain protected. You go to prison, but you do it knowing you prevented a larger institutional disaster." Waverly smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Then at 1000 hours, my partner activates protocols that will release this entire intelligence package to every major news organization in the country, every member of Congress with oversight authority, and every federal prosecutor with jurisdiction over military crimes," Alexis said. "The classified programs that protected you, the sources and methods that allowed you to operate in the shadows, all of it becomes public. The damage to national security will be extensive. Multiple operations will be compromised. People will die as a result of the intelligence being exposed." She paused, letting that sink in. "But you will be destroyed. Publicly. Irrevocably. Every secret you've kept. Every person you've protected. Every system you've corrupted. It all comes to light. Your legacy becomes defined not by your decades of service, but by the single decision you made to have my father murdered for money." Waverly was quiet for a long moment. Alexis could see him working through the scenario, calculating probabilities, understanding that he was genuinely trapped. Both choices led to his destruction. The only variable was whether he destroyed the system in the process. "You're bluffing," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, sir," Alexis replied. "I'm not. I'm a Navy SEAL. I've spent the last 17 years training for this moment. I've spent the last 2 years gathering evidence. I've spent the last week escaping federal custody, freeing my handler, and positioning myself to ensure that your crimes don't disappear into classified files. I'm not bluffing. I'm done hiding." She stood up from the table. "You have until 1000 hours. That's 99 minutes. You can use that time to contact an attorney, to prepare a statement, to make the choice that defines the rest of your life. Or you can try to have me arrested, which will immediately trigger the release protocols, which will ensure that your destruction is far more complete." "You won't survive this," Waverly said quietly. "Regardless of what you do, you won't survive this." "Probably not," Alexis agreed. "But then, my father didn't survive either. Neither did the men and women whose deaths you ordered in service of your corruption. The difference is that I get to ensure their deaths mean something. I get to ensure that the system that protected you gets exposed and reformed. I get to ensure that the next officer thinking about selling out their oath for money understands that there are consequences." She stepped back from the table. 99 minutes, Admiral. What will you choose?" Alexis walked out of the restaurant without waiting for his response. She knew what he would choose. Men like Waverly always made the same calculation in the end. Pride. Career. The belief that they could manipulate the system one final time. He would refuse her offer. He would try to use his authority to contain the situation. And in doing so, he would guarantee his own destruction in the most public, irrevocable way possible. She reached the safe house at 0945 hours. Marcus was waiting at the communications terminal, his finger hovering over the final activation sequence. "He refused?" Marcus asked. "He will," Alexis said. "He's incapable of accepting responsibility. It's not in his psychological profile." She watched the clock on the wall tick forward. 0955 hours. 0956 hours. 0957 hours. At 0958 hours, Marcus activated the final protocols. The intelligence dump flooded across the internet. Every classified document, every encrypted communication, every piece of evidence, all of it released simultaneously, unstoppable, irreversible. By 0959 hours, the story was already breaking on news feeds across the country. By 1000 hours, Admiral Thomas Waverly's career was over. And Alexis Monroe understood that she'd finally achieved what her father had died trying to accomplish. Justice. Not the clean, institutional kind, but the real kind. The kind that costs everything and restores nothing, except the knowledge that corruption had been exposed and accountability had been enforced. She sat in the safe house and watched the news coverage unfold, understanding that her own freedom had just ended as well. But that was the price of truth, and she'd been willing to pay it all along. The Arlington National Cemetery was achingly beautiful in the late afternoon light. Autumn had come early this year, painting the rows of white headstones in shades of gold and amber. Alexis stood at the grave of Captain Richard Monroe, her hand resting against the cold marble, her eyes fixed on the name and dates that represented 17 years of unfinished business. 72 hours had passed since the intelligence dump. 72 hours during which federal agencies had descended on the Bethesda safe house, found it empty, and issued a nationwide manhunt for Lieutenant Commander Alexis Monroe, now classified as a fugitive and a traitor. 72 hours during which every news organization in the country had run stories about Admiral Thomas Waverly's arrest, the military corruption scandal, the exposure of illegal weapons sales that reached back nearly 2 decades. Waverly was in custody awaiting trial. Marcus was in protective custody, cooperating with federal prosecutors. Patricia Holloway had won the Pulitzer Prize for her expose on military corruption. The institutional changes were beginning. Investigations launched, oversight committees formed, policy reviews initiated. But Alexis was standing in a cemetery at the moment when federal agents had finally located her. She'd known they were coming, had anticipated it the moment she'd activated the protocols. There was nowhere to hide in America anymore, not with facial recognition technology and federal surveillance networks that covered every major city and most secondary ones. She'd spent the last 3 days ensuring that Marcus's testimony was solid, that Patricia had all the documentation she needed, that the intelligence package was sufficiently distributed that no single agency could suppress it. And then she'd come here, to her father's grave, to say goodbye before surrendering to whatever justice the system would mete out. The black SUVs pulled into the cemetery in a coordinated formation. Alexis watched them without moving, understanding that this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. She'd crossed the Rubicon when she'd activated the intelligence dump. Everything after that had been epilogue. Federal agents emerged from the vehicles, moving with the practiced precision of law enforcement professionals conducting a high-value apprehension. They approached cautiously, weapons visible but not drawn, treating her with the respect due a trained combatant who understood the mathematics of the situation and would not try something stupid. Lieutenant Commander Monroe, one of the agents, called out. She recognized him, Special Agent Thornton, from her initial interrogation. "You're under arrest for violation of the Espionage Act, treason, theft of classified materials, and conspiracy to commit unauthorized military operations." Alexis raised her hands, showing they were empty, showing she wouldn't resist. She'd made her choice 17 years ago when she'd knelt at her father's graveside and made a promise. Everything since had been the consequence of that choice. "I understand," she said simply. The agents approached, secured her hands with restraints, and read her rights. She didn't speak during the process, didn't explain, didn't offer justifications. What was the point? The evidence spoke for itself. Her actions spoke for themselves. As they guided her toward one of the SUVs, she looked back at her father's grave one final time. "I finished it, Dad," she whispered. "I finally finished what you started." 90 days later, Alexis sat in a federal courtroom. Her attorney, a brilliant constitutional lawyer named Elena Rodriguez who'd volunteered her services, presented the defense strategy before a military tribunal. There was no jury for this trial. Espionage charges fell under military jurisdiction, tried before a panel of senior officers who had to confront the reality of what she'd done. The prosecution presented their case clearly. She had violated the Espionage Act by releasing classified materials. She had committed treason by working against military interests. She had broken federal law multiple times in the commission of her actions. The evidence was irrefutable. But Elena presented something equally compelling: the evidence of Admiral Waverly's crimes. The proof that military institutions had been corrupted from within. The documentation that Alexis's actions, while illegal, had exposed a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the entire armed forces. "Your Honors," Elena said, her voice carrying the particular weight of moral certainty, "Lieutenant Commander Monroe did not act out of disloyalty to the military. She acted out of the deepest loyalty to its principles. The principles of honor, the principles of integrity, the principles of accountability. Admiral Waverly violated those principles. The military system failed to police its own. And Lieutenant Commander Monroe took action to ensure that accountability was achieved." The tribunal deliberated for 4 days. When they returned, the verdict was complicated. Guilty on all counts, there was no way around that. The law had been broken. The classified materials had been released. The facts were undeniable. But the sentencing was unexpected. The presiding officer stood and delivered the judgment. While this tribunal finds Lieutenant Commander Monroe guilty as charged, we acknowledge the exceptional circumstances surrounding her actions. She revealed corruption at the highest levels of military command. She exposed a conspiracy that threatened the integrity of the entire institution. While her methods were illegal, the motivation behind those methods was rooted in genuine military values. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Therefore, this tribunal sentences Lieutenant Commander Alexis Monroe to 15 years in military prison, with the recommendation that this sentence be reviewed for early release after 5 years if her cooperation with ongoing investigations remains forthcoming. Additionally, we recommend a full presidential pardon be considered given the extenuating circumstances and the national security benefits of her revelations. 18 months later, Alexis was released on a presidential pardon. The president himself had approved it, understanding that the political calculus had shifted. Admiral Waverly was convicted on multiple counts. 17 military officers had been indicted on corruption charges. Defense contractor executives were facing federal prosecution. The military institution was implementing sweeping reforms to prevent future corruption. Alexis walked out of the federal detention facility in Norfolk, Virginia, on a cold February morning. Elena Rodriguez was waiting for her, along with Marcus, who'd been fully exonerated and restored to active duty. "Welcome back to the world," Marcus said, pulling her into an embrace. Alexis felt something loosen in her chest. A tension she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. She was free, not just physically but legally. The system had acknowledged that she'd acted with justification, however illegal her methods. 6 months later, Alexis stood in front of the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. She'd been invited to speak to a class of midshipmen about the costs of integrity, the weight of doing the right thing when the system fails to police itself. She was no longer an active duty officer. Her resignation had been accepted as part of the pardon negotiations. But she was something else now. A symbol. A reminder that accountability mattered. She looked out at the young faces in the auditorium and thought about her father. Thought about the 17 years she'd spent training, preparing, fighting for justice in the shadows. Thought about what it had cost her, her career, her freedom, her certainty that the system she'd served actually deserved that service. "The hardest thing about maintaining integrity in a corrupted system," she told them, "is accepting that you might have to break the system to save it." Admiral Waverly believed he was above accountability. He believed his rank and his connections protected him. He was wrong. And when the system failed to hold him accountable, I had to step outside that system to ensure that accountability happened. She paused, meeting the eyes of the young officers in training. "I'm not telling you to do what I did. I'm telling you to understand that there are moments when the system is more important than your career, more important than your safety, more important than your freedom. And if you ever encounter those moments, you have to be ready to pay whatever price they demand. Because the alternative, a military that tolerates corruption, that protects its own above all else, is worse than any personal cost you might have to pay." After the speech, a young woman approached her. Midshipman 4th class, dark hair, determined expression. There was something familiar about her. "Ma'am," the young woman said, "I'm the daughter of Captain Marcus Holloway. He was killed in Iraq in 2009. I just wanted to thank you. My father never got justice. But what you did, it means his death wasn't for nothing." Alexis felt something shift inside her chest. Another daughter. Another family affected by military corruption. Another reason why the fight had mattered. She placed a hand on the young woman's shoulder. "Your father's memory is honored," Alexis said, "and the system that killed him is being reformed. Make sure you're part of that reformation when your time comes." That evening, Alexis returned to Arlington National Cemetery. It had become a ritual, the place where she came when she needed to remember why she'd sacrificed everything. She stood at her father's grave, just as she had on that day when federal agents had come to arrest her. "It's done, Dad," she said, her hand touching the cold marble. "Admiral Waverly is in prison. The corruption is exposed. The system is changing. It's not perfect. It's not clean. But it's accountable now. That's all I ever wanted, for the system you believed in to actually live up to the principles you died defending." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves and stone. Alexis stood there in the fading light, understanding that she'd finally laid down a burden she'd carried for 17 years. She was no longer the daughter seeking vengeance. She was no longer the operative gathering intelligence in the shadows. She was something new, a voice for accountability, a reminder that corruption had consequences, a symbol that integrity could triumph even in a broken system. Her father had taught her to be dangerous. She'd learned the lesson, but she'd also learned something he never got to discover, that being dangerous was only meaningful if the danger was used in service of something larger than yourself. She turned from the grave and walked away into the growing darkness, her head held high, finally at peace with the choices she'd made and the cost she'd paid. The hunt was over. Justice had been served, and Alexis Monroe could finally move forward into whatever came next, carrying her father's legacy with her, not as a burden, but as a beacon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.